I
The
can't
night
believe you would say
everything
that here.
changes.
It's the truth,
The
and you know
ballroom
it.
was alive
Both of you,
with golden
calm down.
lights
This
and
isn't the
champagne
place.
bubbles that floated through the air like tiny promises. The annual charity gala had drawn everyone who mattered in our small city, and Ethan stood near the marble columns watching his wife Olivia move through the crowd with the grace of someone born to belong. Her emerald dress caught the light as she laughed with friends, and he felt that familiar warmth in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced on their wedding day 3 years ago. Olivia was radiant tonight, and Ethan could not take his eyes off her. She had worked so hard this past year managing her boutique and helping with the community projects. They had argued about finances, about her long hours, about his jealousy over her success, but tonight none of that mattered. She was here beside him celebrating, and he wanted to be the man she deserved, the man who trusted her completely. By 9 o'clock Olivia had already consumed several glasses of wine. Her cheeks were flushed, and her movements had become more animated, more loose. She danced with her friends, and Ethan noticed how she stumbled slightly when she turned, but he said nothing. She was happy, and he did not want to be the controlling husband, the jealous one who ruined her joy. Laughing, she waved at him from across the room, and he waved back, feeling both proud and uncertain. Around midnight things shifted. Olivia was dancing with a tall man named Marcus, someone she had mentioned from her business networking group. Ethan felt a strange tightness in his stomach as he watched them dance closer than was necessary. Their hands lingered during the partner exchanges, and Ethan saw Marcus lean in to whisper something that made Olivia giggle. That giggle was new, different from her usual laugh. It belonged only to him, Ethan thought, but his mind was already creating stories, creating doubts. He wanted to go to her, to claim her, to remind her that she was his wife, but something held him back. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was fear of appearing possessive. He remained by the columns watching. The night continued, and Olivia drank more and more. Her words became slurred, and her movements unsteady. At one point she nearly fell, and Marcus caught her arm, steadying her, and the gesture felt intimate in a way that made Ethan's heart ache. Then around 1 in the morning Olivia stumbled away from the group. Her eyes were unfocused, and her hand reached out as if searching for balance. She moved toward the garden doors, and Ethan watched her disappear into the darkness outside. He stood frozen, torn between his trust in her and the creeping fear that something was wrong, something was happening that he should stop, but he remained paralyzed by uncertainty and the terrible knowledge that whatever happened next would change everything. Between them, secrets in the dark. Ethan waited for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. His hands were clenched into fists, and his jaw ached from grinding his teeth. He told himself that she just needed air, that she was embarrassed about drinking too much, that she was fine, but the doubt gnawed at him like a living thing. Marcus had excused himself from the party about 5 minutes after Olivia left, and that detail burned in Ethan's mind like a brand. The coincidence felt too convenient, too damning, and yet he had no proof of anything, just terrible assumptions and the quicksand feeling of jealousy pulling him under. Finally Ethan made his way to the garden doors and stepped into the cool night air. The garden was illuminated by small lanterns that cast long shadows across the manicured hedges and stone pathways. He called out Olivia's name softly at first, then louder. His voice seemed to disappear into the darkness unanswered. He walked deeper into the garden following the pathways, and that was when he saw them near the old stone fountain. Olivia was leaning against Marcus, and his hand was on her arm. His face was close to hers, and they were speaking in low voices that Ethan could not quite hear. Ethan felt something break inside his chest, crying internally. He wanted to look away, but his feet kept moving forward, drawn by a force he could not control. Marcus saw him first, and his hand dropped immediately from Olivia's arm. He stepped back and offered a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Olivia turned toward Ethan, and her face registered confusion, as if she was seeing him for the first time that night. Marcus offered some explanation, something about making sure Olivia had water and fresh air, but his words felt hollow and rehearsed. Ethan barely heard them. He was looking at his wife, at the way her dress was slightly disheveled, at the slight smudge of lipstick at the corner of her mouth, at the way she could not quite focus on his face. He wanted to ask her questions, to demand answers, but looking at her intoxicated state he realized that any answers she gave would be unreliable. Her memory was already slipping away like sand through his fingers. He took Olivia's hand and led her back toward the ballroom, and she did not resist. She seemed relieved to leave Marcus behind, though her arm kept reaching back as if she had forgotten something important, or someone important. Ethan said nothing. All the questions built up inside him like a dam ready to break, but he stayed silent because he knew that breaking silence now would mean shattering everything they had built together, and he was not yet ready for that destruction. The weight of knowing. The drive home was silent except for the sound of Olivia's breathing becoming deeper and more rhythmic as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Her head rested against the window, and occasionally she would murmur something incomprehensible, her hand reaching out and then falling back to her lap. Ethan drove carefully, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He replayed every moment over and over, trying to construct the truth from fragments of a story he had not fully witnessed. When they arrived home, Ethan helped Olivia inside, her body heavy and uncoordinated. He guided her to the bathroom where she immediately got sick. Crying, She apologized, between retches her words slurred and pathetic, and Ethan felt his anger soften into something more complicated, into pity and sadness and fear. He held her hair back and rubbed her spine and hated himself for the tenderness, even as his mind continued its relentless interrogation of the night. He got her into bed and she fell asleep almost immediately, her breathing evening out into the deep sleep of someone who had drunk far too much. Ethan stood in the doorway watching his wife's chest rise and fall and felt the weight of the knowledge he carried, the weight of what he had seen and what he had not seen, the weight of the space between reality and assumption, between facts and interpretation. He went to the kitchen and poured himself a drink, his hands shaking as he lifted the glass. The alcohol burned his throat, but he barely tasted it. He sat at the dark table and allowed himself to imagine the worst scenario: Marcus's hands on her, he kissed her in that garden, while Ethan stood nearby like a fool, like a man whose marriage was crumbling in the darkness and he was too weak to stop it, laughing bitterly at himself, at his weakness, at the lies he had been telling himself about trust and about love. But underneath the terrible scenarios another voice whispered, asking him what he actually knew. He had seen them standing together, yes. He had seen Marcus's hand on her arm, yes. But had he seen them kiss? Had he heard explicit words? Had he witnessed anything concrete that proved his worst fears? Or was he constructing a narrative from the pieces of his own insecurity and his own mistakes? By 3 in the morning, Ethan was exhausted both physically and emotionally. He climbed into bed next to Olivia, careful not to touch her. His mind would not quiet, though his body demanded sleep. He lay in the darkness beside his wife and understood that he was now carrying a secret, a knowledge that belonged only to him. She would wake up tomorrow with no memory of what had happened after leaving the ballroom, no memory of Marcus, no memory of the garden, no memory of anything that had transpired in those missing hours. And Ethan would have to decide whether to tell her and risk destroying her with shame and embarrassment and the knowledge that he had witnessed her vulnerability, or whether to keep silent and let the secret rot inside him, poisoning their marriage from the inside out. The terrible truth was that he loved her too much to hurt her, and he hated her enough to want to punish her, and he was trapped in that impossible space between love and betrayal, with no way out that did not involve sacrifice and pain. Unraveling the truth. The next morning Olivia woke with a headache that seemed to split her skull in two. She stumbled to the bathroom and Ethan listened to her groan and get sick again, and he felt no satisfaction in her suffering, only a deep aching sadness that seemed to have no bottom. When she emerged she was pale and fragile, and she collapsed onto the couch with a bottle of water and a look of profound regret, crying. She muttered that she could not remember anything after dancing, and Ethan felt the words like daggers in his heart because she was telling him the truth, or at least her version of it. For 3 days Ethan said nothing, but his silence became its own form of communication. Olivia sensed the distance between them, the way he turned away in bed, the way his responses to her became clipped and polite. She asked him repeatedly if something was wrong, if she had done something at the party, and each time he said nothing was wrong, everything was fine. But his eyes told a different story. His eyes held oceans of anger and pain and accusation, and Olivia could see it even through her hangover fog. On the 4th day, Olivia finally confronted him directly. They were in the kitchen, and she set down her coffee cup with more force than necessary and demanded to know what was happening between them, crying. She said that his coldness was worse than any argument they had ever had, that she felt him pulling away from her, and she could not bear it any longer. Ethan stood at the counter and felt the dam inside him begin to crack. He told her everything. He described how he had watched her dance with Marcus, how he had followed her to the garden, how he had seen them together near the fountain. His words came out sharp and cutting, and he did not soften them with kindness or consideration. He wanted her to hurt the way he was hurting. He wanted her to feel the shame and the guilt and the betrayal, but as he spoke he watched her face, and something inside him began to shift. Olivia listened with growing horror and confusion, and then something else, something like relief mixed with anger. She told him that Marcus had walked her to the garden because she felt faint, that he had been trying to help her get water from the fountain house nearby, that he had been a perfect gentleman. She said that Marcus had told her he had a business proposal for her, something involving collaborating on a fashion line, and he had wanted to discuss it away from the noise of the party. As she spoke, Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him. The narrative he had constructed so carefully began to crumble like old brick. His mind had written a story that his eyes had never actually witnessed. His jealousy and his insecurity had filled in the blanks with fiction, and now he had to face the possibility that he had been wrong all along. But underneath that realization was another, more terrible realization, that he had weaponized his doubts against his wife, that he had judged her for something that existed only in his imagination. Ashes of trust. Olivia stood up from the table and her face was streaked with tears, crying. She said that she could not believe he thought she was capable of infidelity, that she had trusted him to believe in her, to trust her judgment, and instead he had assumed the worst about her. She said that his silence these past 4 days had felt like being slowly poisoned, that every cold response, every turned shoulder had been another accusation building on top of nothing but his own fears. Ethan tried to justify his suspicions by talking about how much she had drunk, about how she had looked at Marcus, about the way the night had unfolded, but even as he spoke he knew that his explanations were hollow. His jealousy had constructed a temple of lies, and now that temple was collapsing and he was standing in the rubble of his own making. He had hurt the person he loved most in this world based on assumptions and interpretations and the terrible burden of knowledge that was not knowledge at all but only assumed knowledge. The next weeks were painful and slow. Olivia withdrew from him emotionally. She still lived in the same house, but she existed in a separate space. The boutique became her refuge, and Ethan began to understand the price of his mistrust. He had tried to protect his heart by building walls, and instead he had destroyed the very thing he was trying to protect. He realized that trust is not something you can test or verify through secret surveillance. Trust is something you give freely, and when you take it back you cannot simply put it back together again. One evening Ethan sat down and wrote Olivia a letter, laughing sadly. As he wrote, because the words seemed so inadequate to express his regret, he told her that he had been wrong not just about that night, but about his approach to their entire marriage. He explained how his insecurity had poisoned his thinking, and how his silence had been an act of punishment toward her for crimes she had never committed. He apologized for not trusting her and for assuming the worst and for letting his jealousy convince him that his imagined truth was more real than her actual truth. Olivia read the letter sitting at the kitchen table, and she cried, crying not from anger but from grief for the trust that had been broken and for the painful road ahead. She told Ethan that she forgave him, but that forgiveness was not the same as healing, that rebuilding trust would take time and effort, and that they would both have to be willing to do the work. She said that she loved him, but that love was not enough. Love required trust and communication and the willingness to believe in each other even when doubts arose. As they moved forward together, Ethan and Olivia began to truly talk for the first time, really talk about their fears and insecurities, about the ways their past relationships had wounded them, about the jealousy that had driven him to construct narratives instead of asking questions. They started therapy together and slowly began the long process of rebuilding what his actions had damaged. They learned that assumptions are not facts, that silence is a choice, that every moment of suspicion deferred is a moment of connection lost. The marriage survived, but it was transformed. It was no longer the marriage of naive trust, but rather a marriage built on conscious trust, on the daily choice to believe in each other even when fear whispered otherwise. They learned that relationships require constant work and intention, and that the greatest threat to love is not infidelity, but rather the stories we tell ourselves when we should be asking our partners the truth. Lessons and learnings from the story. The tale of Ethan and Olivia teaches us several profound truths about human relationships and personal growth. First, we learn the danger of assumption. When Ethan witnessed a fragment of truth, he allowed his insecurity and jealousy to fill in the blanks with a narrative of infidelity. His mind created a complete story from incomplete information, and he judged his wife based on this fiction rather than reality. This reflects a common human tendency where we interpret ambiguous situations through the lens of our fears and insecurities. Second, the story illustrates the poison of silence. Ethan chose not to communicate his concerns directly. Instead, he withdrew emotionally and used silence as a weapon to punish Olivia for imagined transgressions. This silence became its own form of betrayal, more damaging in some ways than direct conflict, because it left Olivia confused and desperate for answers. She was being judged for a crime that existed only in her husband's mind. The lesson here is that communication, even when difficult, is always preferable to silence, because silence breeds misunderstanding and resentment. Third, we see the destructive nature of unchecked jealousy. Ethan's jealousy about Olivia's success and her interactions with others had already created distance between them. Before the party incident, their relationship was already strained by his insecurity. When he saw her dancing and laughing with Marcus, his jealousy found confirmation for all his worst fears. This teaches us that jealousy is often a reflection of our own insecurity and lack of self-worth rather than an accurate reflection of our partner's character. When we allow jealousy to guide our actions, we inevitably hurt those we love. Fourth, the story demonstrates how our past experiences shape our present relationships. Ethan's tendency toward jealousy and suspicion likely stemmed from wounds he carried from before his marriage with Olivia. By allowing these old wounds to dictate his present behavior, he wounded his wife and damaged his marriage. The lesson is that we must examine our own emotional baggage and work to heal our past so that we do not unconsciously transfer our pain onto our present relationships. Fifth, we learn about the importance of trust as a conscious choice. Trust is not something we can verify through investigation or control. Rather, trust is a choice we make daily to believe in our partner even when doubts arise. Ethan attempted to build trust through surveillance and assumption when what trust actually requires is vulnerability and the willingness to be disappointed. The paradox is that by trying to protect himself from betrayal through suspicion, Ethan actually betrayed his wife through his lack of faith in her. Finally, the story teaches us that relationships require ongoing work and communication. The aftermath of Ethan's actions showed that forgiveness does not instantly heal betrayal, rather healing requires both partners to be willing to examine the relationship honestly and to commit to change. Ethan and Olivia had to engage in therapy and difficult conversations. They had to rebuild trust brick by brick through demonstrated consistency and open, honest communication over time. This teaches us that love is not enough. Love must be combined with respect, honesty, and the willingness to keep choosing your partner even after disappointment. The ultimate message of this story is that in our closest relationships, our greatest enemy is often not an external threat, but rather our own insecurity, our unhealed wounds, and our inability to communicate authentically. By examining these internal forces and choosing to trust and communicate rather than assume and accuse, we create the space where real love can flourish.